Good morning, everybody. Could we find now and get ready to start? We've a lot of really important speakers today, and I want to make sure that we give everybody the chance to speak and to share their amazing work with us. So good morning, everybody. I'm Angela Fraser-Wicks. I'm Chair of Trustees at the Charity Family Rights Group and founding member of their Parents Panel, which is one of their panels made up of people with lived experience of the child welfare and family justice system. But today I am here in my role as a woman with lived experience. I am a birth mother myself. I lost my eldest two children to adoption back in 2004. I have a teenage daughter with no local authority involvement. And in 2020, I was reunited with my eldest son. I have been incredibly fortunate since losing my children to have been able to work with some amazing people who have empowered me to use my voice, to use my experiences to help try and influence sustainable and meaningful change within the system. And I'm delighted that today I'm not the only person who's speaking from that perspective. So before I start completely, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. I'd also like to welcome everybody who is joining us online. You will be here for this morning's session, but unfortunately not for this afternoon. We will have to say goodbye then. So housekeeping. The toilets, if anybody needs them, are directly out of the doors to the left and the right. I'm assuming those joining from home already know where their toilets are, and I'm relying on them to be able to find them. Also to be able to make their own coffee at break time. We are expecting a fire alarm. It's going to go off during one of the earlier presentations during a video. It should go off for a few seconds. We don't need to panic. We don't need to leave the room. If it goes off at any other point in the room, then we do need to leave. And also those at home, if your fire alarm goes off, please do leave. Don't sit there. So back to today and the importance of why we're all here and the whole theory behind today's event. So when we came together as all different members with different projects, we discussed what today should be about. And we discussed, should it be policy that we're influencing? Should it be practice? And that's when we decided that actually what we really need to influence is culture. So we need to influence hearts and minds, and that's where the theme of the conference really came about. Because policy and practice both only work if we really listen to the people who are using the system, the women who are going to speak with us today, some of whom who have travelled to London for the first time, some of whom are speaking for the first time. And as I'm sure you can imagine, it's quite a scary experience. So we're going to do everything we can throughout the day to be as respectful and inclusive as possible. And when I talk about inclusion, I always think of a wonderful quote that is, inclusion isn't just inviting us to take a seat at the table. It's about believing we belong there. And I think every project that we're going to hear about today really understands that, really believes that we do belong as part of the discussion. And that even for those of us who've been through some of the most negative and harrowing experiences, and some of us only just really survived those experiences, by being given the opportunity to use that experience to help other people is healing and empowering in equal measure. And I would just like to, before we start, thank everybody who has been involved in these projects, because I've seen firsthand the difference it's made to the women involved and the difference it's making to the wider communities as a whole. So thank you all for that. Thank you to Kat for just being sterling and doing an amazing amount of work behind the scenes just to bring today together. It has not been an easy feat. There's been a lot of moving parts, and Kat has been at the heart of making sure that all of those working parts come together in a very thoughtful and meaningful way. So just thank you, Kat, and we're so pleased that your train finally got you here this morning, because even that wasn't going to. And I'm also aware that we are going to have people arriving late because transport links are being British transport links. So, we'll do our best. So I'm watching time, but what I really wanted to get everybody to think about was the power of collaboration and the power of working together. Right. We think that's it. We think we're done. We think we're ready to go. Brilliant. So actually what I just wanted to really highlight is obviously there are a lot of people here, myself included, with lived experience of the system. There are going to be a lot of discussions that are difficult. We have a performance later that I know is going to be quite difficult for a lot of people to watch. So what we've ensured is that we have some safe spaces if people need to use them. And that doesn't just apply to our speakers, that applies to everybody who needs it. If you need to take some time, please do take some time. We'd like to educate and inform, not simply traumatise and upset everybody. The rooms that we need to go to are on the first floor, and we have staff members throughout the room who can take you there, direct you there, could stay with you if you would like them to, and make sure you get back again. The staff, I believe, I can't see because are all located over here. They're waving furiously, but I think if you're hiding behind a pillar, you probably can't see them. But if you do need any help to find those rooms, please do come and get them. Or if you spot somebody else is struggling, please do let us know, and we'll ensure that we provide support for them. And my fabulous assistant down here has got little cards telling me how long I've got to go, which is wonderful, because then at least I haven't got to worry about that. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to find my agenda now that I've lost my notes. Well, there's also a prayer space available if anybody needs it at any point. That's absolutely fine. If you ask a staff member, they will direct you there. So I'm going to introduce the first two speakers for this morning's session. The first is a video. The second is in person, but I'm going to do both introductions now so you don't have to put up with me jumping in between and risk another alarm going off. So our first video is from Sally Hogg. Sally is a senior policy fellow at the Faculty of Education, and I'm too stubborn to wear varifocals, so please bear with me. At the University of Cambridge. Previously, Sally was head of policy and campaigning at the Parent Infant Foundation, where she led work to raise awareness of the importance of early relationships and to drive change at a local and national level. This included coordinating the 1001 Days movement and all-party parliamentary group. She's speaking today in her current role as Assistant Director at the Royal Foundation Centre for Early Childhood, founded by the Princess of Wales. And immediately after that, I'm going to ask Isabel to run up. So immediately after that, we will have Isabel Trowler, who was appointed the government's first chief social worker for children and families in 2013. As a social worker working in London boroughs, she knows the challenges all too well of safeguarding children and families, and has worked tirelessly for children and families, and was recognised for her services to children's social care in 2024 when she was awarded a CBE by His Majesty the King. So I'm going to hand over to the first video now, and I will join you after Isabel's session.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sally Hogg, and I'm Assistant Director at the Royal Foundation Centre for Early Childhood. I'm going to set the scene a little bit for you this morning by talking about the importance of early childhood, the period from conception through first 1,001 days till children are 2, and beyond that till children are 5, and why that period is such an important time. And I hope this frames the discussions you're going to have later today. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. It looks like a fantastic agenda, and I'm sure you're going to have lots and lots of amazing insights and food for thought. I'll share my slides with you just to talk you through my presentation. For those of you who don't know, the Centre for Early Childhood is part of the Royal Foundation. The Royal Foundation is the charitable body for the Prince and Princess of Wales. And the Centre for Early Childhood was set up 4 years ago by the Princess of Wales for 2 reasons. First, during her working career, the Princess had met lots of people who had experienced multiple disadvantage and adversity. She met people in prison, in homeless shelters, in substance misuse services, and time and again she heard stories of how what happened to them had its roots early in their lives. And so she started to think about the opportunity that early childhood presents to prevent some of those problems from occurring later on. The Princess also has this inspiring vision for a society that is more nurturing, more connected, that's really thriving. And she again sees the roots of that lying in early childhood, that if we can nurture our youngest children and build in them the ability to know themselves, to get along with other people, then we can create a stronger society in the future. And so we, as a Centre for Early Childhood, run a campaign that's known as Shaping Us. And it's very much about this idea that our early years, what happens in early childhood, pregnancy, and the first years of life, shapes the people that we become. And because society is made up of people, we're shaping our future society. And so everything you're thinking about today is about that. It's about shaping future people that our today's babies will become, and shaping the future society that we will all live in together. And that's very much the way in which we as a centre and the Princess sees this. There are lots of things that are unique or different about early childhood, about that period from conception, the first 1,001 days, so through to children of 2 and beyond. And one of them is just how interconnected babies and their parents are during that period. Throughout life, we are deeply interconnected with our families, but there is something particular about early childhood. And I think it's important. There's this quote from a paediatrician called Donald Winnicott, who was also a psychotherapist, that says there's no such thing as a baby. You can't see a baby on their own. There is always a baby with someone. We can't understand babies and what's going on for them and their well-being unless we understand the hands that are holding them, the people that are looking after them, their parents. Babies' experiences and well-being is entirely shaped by the people around them. We're a species that's born very vulnerable and dependent, and so babies are totally dependent on the people around them for their care. But also, I'd argue you can't see a mother alone. There's no such thing as a mother unless you also see a child, and that's true not just for the mothers who are holding the babies, but for the women for whom they've lost their babies in pregnancy, or they've had baby loss after birth, or their child, maybe they've had to leave their child because they're in the criminal justice system, or their child's in the care system. For those women, we have to understand them as mothers as well. So this idea that actually there is no such thing as a baby or a mother, there's always both of them together. And that's really important, that we, whether we're working with children or whether we're working with women or other parents, that we understand that huge interconnectedness. Pregnancy and early childhood is a time of enormous vulnerability. It's a time of vulnerability for women. We know, for example, that 30% of cases of domestic abuse start in pregnancy. We know that you are, as a woman, more likely to have a severe episode of mental health issues in that first few weeks and months after birth than any other point in your life. We know that the leading cause of death for new mothers is suicide, are disproportionately represented in child protection statistics. We know that you're more likely to be a victim of homicide in your first year of life than at any other point. But it's also, importantly, an enormous age of opportunity. So for women, for new mothers, excellent expectant mothers, you will have enormous amounts of contact with, maybe not enormous amounts, you'll have more contact with public services during this time than often at any other. We see women, very few women don't give birth without some sort of help around them. Most women will have some contact, maybe late contact if they are more disadvantaged, but with maternity services late in pregnancy. So there's an opportunity there. And we know for families, even families that have had very difficult experiences of engaging with services in the past and lots of adversity in their own lives, but there's a real desire to do better. Most parents want to do the best for their child and be the best parents they can be, and there's something we can really tap into there to support them in that change. What I'm going to talk about from now on is about the brain science of early childhood, because that really shows how this is such an age of opportunity. We know, and this slide shows, that babies' brains develop faster in early childhood than at any point in their life. There's this stat that you might have heard, that you grow 1 million new neural connections a second in this period of life. Babies' brains are growing at a rapid pace, and they don't just grow according to a predetermined blueprint. They are shaped by what happens around them. And that means we have this huge opportunity to shape those brains and their developing bodies as well in a positive way. What this this huge kind of plasticity of the brain, this huge change that's happening means is that it's really important. But it also means that we have the chance for repair during this period. Even if babies don't, even if the first few months of life aren't quite right, the brain is still plastic. We can still make change. And that's a really important message for those of us working with families in this period. So this is a graph from the Harvard Centre for the Developing Child, which talks about, how able the brain is to make changes. And you can see just in this early period of life, just how malleable the brain is, how much change we can make. It never stops, and that's an important message as well. We could always make things better. We're all still learning and changing. If you weren't able to learn and change, there'd be no point in me speaking to you now, because you wouldn't be able to take on new information. We can always change and adapt, but it's so much easier early in life. It's easier to lay the right foundations, to connect neural circuits in the right way while they're still connecting, than to try and change things once those connections have been made. So this is a huge age opportunity. If we can get things right for babies, we can really lay some brilliant foundations on which later life develops. And I think that analogy of foundations is a really important one. If you've got strong foundations, then you can build what can be a more stable building on top of it. Everything that happens next still has to be right. We're not guaranteeing that children will have an amazing life just because we get the foundations right, but it will be easier. And similarly, if we have shaky foundations, even if the next stages of the building are right, there might still be some underlying vulnerabilities because those things weren't quite right at the start. So just like a building with shaky foundations might need extra support, so too a child who's had that shaky start might need more support later in life, but we can always make things better. So babies are developing really rapidly. That development is shaped by their relationships, their surrounding, and their experiences. We're very adaptive as a species. Our brains aren't just developing in a set way, they're shaped by everything around us. So you can hear me because your brain has developed the ability to hear and process the language that you heard in early childhood. And if you'd been exposed to a different language, then you would be able to understand that one instead or as well. Our brains adapt to the world that we're born into, and we can make the most of that by surrounding children with environments and relationships that support healthy development. But that plasticity is, as this quote says, a double-edged sword. So we adapt to our environments. That means if our environments are healthy environments, we adapt well. But if they're difficult, we'll adapt to that. So this is a picture from a book called Cave Baby. And I think it illustrates that idea, if you are this baby, if you're growing up in an environment of saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths, or whatever the modern day equivalent of that is, adversity and stress and threat, you will adapt to that. And you'll adapt in a way that is healthier for that environment. So this baby might adapt with a heightened fight or flight response because that's what they need if they're going to live in this world of these beasts. For children who are developing in contexts of high stress and adversity, where there's a threat potentially of abuse or harm, they too will grow up with a heightened flight or fight response because they're adapting to their situations in ways that are going to help them in those situations, but ultimately we know may not be helpful in other parts of their lives. So a child who's grown up in an environment of conflict and threat might develop that heightened flight response. But then if they go into a classroom setting and they're quicker to lash out or quicker to lose their temper, that is no longer an adaptive and helpful response. Actually, that is a vulnerability that may cause them problems later in life. So it's not that these children there's anything wrong with them. Their brains have adapted and their bodies have adapted in healthy ways, but not ways that are necessarily going to be useful for today's society. And that's why we need to try and create the environments around children which they adapt to in a way that is useful and helpful for the rest of their lives. And it's relationships that are the active ingredient that shapes our development. And by that, I mean the interactions that babies have with the adults, the caring adults around them. So I talked about kind of how there's no such thing as a baby on their own, because babies are so small, so vulnerable, and so unable to do things for themselves. They are totally dependent on the adults around them. And so those adults are constantly shaping the environment, which is then shaping the child. The arms that hold you, babies can't see very far when they're first born. They can only see as far as the face of the mother or father that's holding them. So that, that parent is the environment that is shaping the child, or is mediating the environment around them to shape the child's development. Relationships nurture development. If you have a grown-up around you who makes you feel safe, who comforts you when you cry, who starts to talk to you or notice what you're interested in the world and tell you about it, that supports you to learn and develop in many healthy ways. We learn language because when we look at something and a grown-up says the word, we associate the two things, and that's how we know what things are called. Same about our relationships. If someone notices when we're sad and labels that for us when we're a baby and teaches us how to calm down by soothing us, we learn what sadness is, we learn to talk about it, and we learn eventually to deal with it by ourselves. So everything that happens in early relationships is helping children to develop. And those relationships also protect us from adversity. So if you imagine a child who is in a context of maybe poor housing, conflict, but has a parent who is attentive to their needs, then that will reduce the impact of those things on their life, because the baby feels safe and secure. The parent is buffering that external world, but the baby's experience is, when I'm hungry, I get fed. When I need to be soothed, I get soothed. I have my needs met, and that therefore helps that child to develop in a more healthy way socially and emotionally. Obviously, those other things still need to be dealt with. We still want our children to have that wider environment that works, but actually we can buffer a lot of that on the impact of them. But the converse is also true. So for a baby, because they're so dependent on adults, so even if we think the wider environment might seem like an okay one, if that child is not getting the nurturing care they need, that's an incredible form of stress and adversity for their developing brain and body. So there is this concept that the Harvard Centre for the Developing Child have of different levels of stress. And actually, if you do not consistently not have your needs met as a child, so you consistently, not just, someone's a bit slow to pick you up, or once somebody didn't notice that you needed something, if you're consistently not getting the level of care and support you need, then your body's on that heightened stress, alert that's not being soothed, not being brought down. And that's like a car engine revving all the time. And that starts to impact on the child's developing brain and body in ways that play out through their life course. That early level of that toxic stress, actually, we know now leads to not only children whose behaviour and ways of understanding the world might be more difficult for them, but actually who are also more likely to have things like heart disease or cardiovascular problems and other things later on in life, because they're left there of that heightened level of stress early on. So yeah, there can be lifelong consequences of children's bodies and brains being exposed to that level of stress and adversity early in life, which is why we need to support parents to provide children with that nurturing care early in life. Or in the case of the social care system, if they can't provide that stable nurturing care, we need to act really quickly, because you only get this one chance at early development. And as I said later, yes, you can change things later on, but you're building on shaky foundations then. Whereas if you do stuff early, we can get those foundations right. And the behaviours that challenge us later as professionals, or even as members of the public dealing with people who suffer from multiple disadvantage, and where that comes out in potentially challenging behaviours, that can often be understood as an adaptive response to what happened to them early in life. So that child who's learned that heightened flight or fight response, that level of stress response because of what's happened to them early in life, will be the person who lashes out later on. And we can see the roots. So we can see these intergenerational cycles where the roots of behaviours later can be understood because somebody's needs were not met early in life. So I've talked a lot about the importance of relationships, about what's really vital for children. The most important thing they can have is that stable, sensitive, nurturing care, at least one person in their life who is there for them and who meets their needs and holds them in mind. But that doesn't happen in a vacuum. Parents are not just able to be that parent or not. We can build their capacities to be that parent. We can support them to provide sensitive, nurturing care. I used to work at the NSPCC, and we ran antenatal programs with parents who had multiple disadvantage, who'd maybe had previous children taken away. And we showed that we could work with them to understand what babies needed from them and to provide that sensitive, nurturing care. But that's far more difficult to do and impossible for some people to do if their own needs aren't being met. You know, I'm sure all of us, if we're parents, will have had that moment where you're stressed, you're distracted, your child asks for something and you ignore it, or you get cross with them. You know, we know from our later experiences that we can't always be the parent we want to be when there's moments of stress and tension. And for parents facing multiple disadvantage and with constant threats to their own security and way of life and really high levels of stress, it's really, really hard. And, you know, if you don't know where your next meal's from, if your physical safety is under threat, if your housing is unsafe, it's really hard then to find the headspace to be present and nurturing to your children. It's not necessarily that those parents can't do that, but they can't do it in that moment because of all of those things going on. If parents have not ever had those models of anyone providing that sensitive nurturing care to them, it will also be harder to do that because they don't have those models of what that looks like. And so we need to do two things for parents to help them to be the parent that their children need to be. We need to build their capacities, their understanding of what their baby needs and their ability to respond to it sensitively. And we can do that by modelling that with them. If they feel contained, if they know what that kind of nurturing care looks like, that helps them to provide that for their baby. But we also need to reduce the stresses in their life so that they have the space and time to connect with their baby. We need to do both of those things. And I'm going to end with this final quote from the princess, just making that point. So nurtured children are the consequence of nurturing adults. We need to invest in the people around children if we're going to make sure that every child has the best start in life. So if we want to live in a healthy, happy, thriving society in the future, we need to ensure our children are nurtured today. And if we're going to ensure our children are nurtured today, then we need to nurture their parents and the other caring adults around them to make sure that they can provide the care that children need to thrive. So that's a whistle-stop tour through the science of the first 1,001 days and early childhood. And I hope that is useful for you to think about as you go into what is going to be a fascinating day ahead. I hope the conference goes really well and you all enjoy it. And I look forward to hearing some of the recordings myself later and catching up on everything you discuss. Thank you very, very much for inviting me. Goodbye.
Hi everyone. I've got to work out whether to have my glasses on or off, so another spectacle challenge, yeah? Well, hi, it's nice to be here. What a fantastic venue. And thanks for inviting me to join you today, and I'm really, really pleased to be here. And I hope that we look back in 10 years' time and we see today as a landmark moment when policymakers, parents, academics, practitioners and leaders of services were brought together by the brilliant birth companions and their colleagues, took charge of an agenda which has been a long time coming. We need to somehow, some way, change the family experience of children's social care. I have been in this sector for over 30 years with an unfailing desire and interest in the relationship between family and state. And in fact, I was just working out that it's 30 years ago that I was at London School of Economics just across the road and qualified as a social worker. So I haven't moved very far, have I? I think that we take far too many children into the care system when more time, skill, effort and empathy might very well have resulted in families staying together. I think children's social care, despite its very best endeavours, is a public institution which few want to be associated with. The stigma and fear associated with social work and child protection means that families will often do everything else rather than seek our help, even when families really need help and even when the stakes are the highest they could possibly be. I know that this audience knows this very well. I do think that we're seeing a sea change certainly in policy and certainly in pockets of practice across England. The focus on women in particular and their babies and young children has taken centre stage in many and varied ways. New organisations and approaches have emerged, new belongings, pause, fostering families, the Izzy Project, to name a few. We have seen decision-making for mother and baby units in prison undergo a major overhaul with new public appointments and closer scrutiny on fairness and consistency. And the government has announced a raft of new policy, all of which is strongly focused on family well-being and opportunity for all children. And in line with a mission-led culture, which ministers, this new government, so passionately want to see, we need to work out how we work together as a whole system to make sure that families and their very young children get the help they need. And even where the circumstances are such that there does need to be a child protection intervention, that there is clarity and compassion from all quarters of all professional networks. So from my perspective, this is a very exciting time, and there's a real sense of drive and momentum to make genuine changes to how we work to deliver the best for the families we work with. Our Secretary of State, Bridget Phillipson, whenever she talks to us as a department, never fails to make it clear that children's social care is one of her top priorities. In my 12 years in post, I have never heard a Secretary of State, and I have seen a few, express such commitment, and she means it. Earlier this year, the department published the Families First Partnership Programme. The goal is to rebalance the system of support away from late intervention and towards help at every stage of a problem. This is a central plank of delivering on the government's mission to provide children with the very best start in life, to keep children safe, and to break down barriers to opportunity. Families First is relevant to everyone working with children, young people and families, children's social care, all the agencies, and indeed the third sector. Local areas are in the design phase of new ways of working with families, and our statutory guidance, Working Together to Safeguard Children, and the National Practice Framework for Children's Social Care and Ofsted are increasingly aligned to this shared endeavour. Some of the key changes include implementing the family help lead practitioner role, which no longer needs to be a social worker, to build lasting relationships with families. Establishing multi-agency child protection teams to bring a dedicated and fresh focus where there are child protection concerns. Embedding family group decision-making across the whole support and protection system. And closer alignment between targeted early help and child in need work to create a more seamless system for families and bring the whole family approach to a larger number of families across England. Some of you may have heard my critique of early help services in the past, and my position hasn't changed on that. Practitioners in the room and women themselves with lived experience will know that significant social problems arising from addiction, domestic abuse, mental ill health, multi-generational intrafamilial sexual abuse, and serious violent offending, for example, often exacerbated by poverty, racism, and other discrimination, are not factors which can be easily resolved. And whilst prevention has to be the end game, there are many families, for a whole range of reasons, who never get even close to what we typically understand to be early help services. State help does need to be about prevention, but it also has to be about de-escalation, that we hold hope and determination as a system, that families who find themselves in the most serious of situations with the right expertise, advocacy, and value-driven intervention can stop the trajectory of child removal. And even when that does happen, as it will, that we build reunification following removal and we make it business as usual. Families First is all backed by massive investment in children's social care, which we secured at the recent spending review. From April 25, we are making 500 million available to local authorities to roll out family help and child protection nationally, to transform services and transition towards earlier intervention. This is ring-fence funding with clear guidelines including the expectation that families, local families, are involved in co-designing the service response. We're investing 44 million new funding to support children in kinship and foster care, the largest ever national investment in kinship care. So in circumstances where birth families either temporarily or otherwise cannot look after their children, that the first principle of practice is that we seek care through kinship networks. The Children's Wellbeing Bill is still progressing through Parliament, and colleagues in DfE are busy working away on this. There's a number of clauses in the bill directly linked to children's social care, and they will form the next stage of reform. One of the clauses in the bill is around the implementation of multi-agency child protection teams. We want to see far fewer families being drawn into the Section 47 process. But when there is legitimate cause to believe that a child has or is likely to suffer significant harm, that there is a much faster, more forensic and more decisive response to those concerns. But there is not consensus about these changes, and we need to work through safeguarding partnerships. Oh, someone's just shown me something. 1 minute, oh my goodness, I've got so much to say. I think that if we listen to families, then I think that that will guide us towards a better deal. So I'm going to have to whiz through my amazing set of notes, which I spent many hours writing. So to the last little bit. And it's a very long way to go. Okay, hold on. So just back to what I hope's work. It's the art of the impossible. It is rocket science. It's both simple, complicated, and complex. This transformation we seek matters. It's worth the focus and effort. To all those here who have experienced the threat of social care involvement, or been close to losing a child to the state, or indeed has suffered the lifelong deep pain of that. Any practitioner or judge or leader of services who has facilitated that and wishes with every bone in their body it shouldn't have had to happen at all, or happen in the way that it did. The thinkers, the writers, the researchers here, to everyone here today, we are a collective of change makers. The audience is full of change makers. I don't think you'd be here otherwise. So let's harness that. We have hope, determination, a policy framework, data, research, new money, political alignment. Well, and the sun is shining, metaphorically so. We know what the problem is and we know where we need to get to, but we have to work out the how together. So today is part of working out that puzzle. So thinking caps on, enjoy the day, and thanks for listening.
We're going to now share with you some of the research and the amazing projects that we've been involved in as women. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start the introductions as people are making their way up to the stage, and then we should hopefully manage to stick to time. So we have Claire Mason and Dr. Bashar. They'll be going to give us an update on, this is me again with my glasses. I'm too vain to go for very focal, so I do apologise. Both senior research fellows in the team of Professor Karen Broadhurst at Lancaster University. The Born into Care research has been instrumental in the last decade to raise awareness, gather evidence, and inform policy changes for mothers in care proceedings. Ready? Yeah. Excellent. I'll swap sides.
Right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak today. I have my colleague Bashar Al-Roux, who actually is the brains behind this. So I'm getting to present it, but he's done all the work. So I just want to really acknowledge that. If, like you, your heart is racing and my heart is in my mouth, having heard these wonderful women, I'm about to bring you back to earth with some numbers and graphs, which I'm sure will be maybe what we all need right now. So yeah, I'm Claire Mason. I work at the Centre for Child and Family Justice Research at Lancaster University. I've been part of the Born into Care partnership, led by Professor Karen Broadhurst, who sadly can't be with us today, and also David Ford at Swansea University. There's a whole team of amazing people, most of whom have done the work that I'm going to be presenting today. Because we've got a sea of people with lived experience of both as practitioners and parents, I'm not going to share a lot of the qualitative data today because you're here and you know it and you've heard how could I follow that. What we really want to do is to give you some context around the statistics. All the research series is been supported by the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, and I know Emma is here representing them today. All the reports are freely available. It's been a partnership, as I've said, between Nuffield, Lancaster and Swansea universities. The two most recent updated reports are they've just come out, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those today. Just a little bit, when I talk about newborns, I'm talking about babies less than 2 weeks old. And when I talk about infants, I'm talking about under ones, or some people in the reports refer to those as babies. So I've got a number of key messages, which I just think really contextualise why we're all here, why this matters so much. But beneath all these figures, as we've so clearly heard, are individual parents and individual babies. And I don't want us to lose sight of that as we look at these numbers. But the numbers do help us to understand why this is so urgent. So the first message is that under ones consistently make up over a quarter of all children in care proceedings in England and Wales. We've heard how important it is to try to bring down the number of children in care proceedings, and this figure tells us why we need to focus on those youngest. It's not surprising, perhaps, given the vulnerability that we've heard from Sally Hogg, but we also know that the decisions we make about these babies are life-changing, not just for parents, but for those babies too. The second key message is the first finding that came out of Born Into Care, which was to break down those under ones. And what we can see is that consistently they are representing a high number of the newborns are representing a high number of those infants. So if we look at the data between 2011 and 2023, it's 47% of those under ones were issued with proceedings within the first 2 weeks of life. So in the vast majority of cases, we are talking about women being issued with proceedings in a maternity context. So key message 2, this is the same message about these infants, just under half of applications issued within 2 weeks, but I want to show you the trend on this graph. And we can see how this is an increasing proportion of those infants. So the full bar on each of those years is all those under ones, but we're interested in this bottom blue bar here. So in 2011, those newborns made up 40% of those infants, but by 2023, we're at 52%. So that proportion is increasing. I'm now going to have a look here at the rates. So we're measuring rate because it helps us to account for differences in population size. So it's a really useful way to look at trends. And this graph looks at the rate of newborns subject to care proceedings in England and Wales. Now you can see from the blue bar, and this is live births, that actually the number of live births is decreasing across that period. Those blue bars are gradually getting less. However, what the dots show us on each of those bars is the rate of newborns in care proceedings per 10,000 live births. The dotted line is the trend line. So what are we seeing? Even though live births are going down, the rates of newborns in care proceeding is going up. We've got a bit of an anomaly in 2021, that's a COVID year, but we can then see that kind of is coming back up in 2022. The drop in 2023, what Bashar will tell me, is that it's too early to say what that means because we need more years to be able to see that trend line. Is that right, Bashar? There we go. Good. The other thing just to say about this is Wales does look a little bit different from England. And in the most recent report from Nuffield, the numbers of infants in care proceedings and the rates of newborns in care proceedings has dropped slightly. The fourth message is about regional variation, and this really is a point made by Brooklyn just now about postcode lottery, understanding for parents to really understand why is it that if you live in London, you have a much lower chance of your newborn being in care proceedings than if you live in the north of England. So there's a real north-south divide, and of course that is an incredibly complex picture. Deprivation does map onto this to a certain extent, but we need to understand this better, and for parents in different parts of the country, this is a really important question. So consistently, the North East, the North West, and Yorkshire and Humber and Wales have much higher rates. London is consistently the lowest. The South West is interesting, because whereas most regions it's fairly level, in 2022-23 there was a 22% increase in the southwest. Key message 5 is around ethnicity. Now what this graph shows us is the blue bar is the ethnicity of babies in care proceedings. The yellow is the general population. So from this graph, we can see that newborns with mixed or multiple ethnicities are overrepresented in care proceedings. However, we've said here we need to know more because we don't know enough about ethnicity, because until 2016 there wasn't regular data being collected. Key message 6 refers to urgent care proceedings. And again, this is a point that's been made many times, specifically by Karen, that we can see this increase in the use of emergency hearings. And I really want to come back to Sally's point for this about how we talk about how important those early days are for an infant, how important it is that their parent is able to attune to them, to be with them. If you are facing care proceedings and are expected to be in court within a day or two of giving birth, what on earth chance have you got to attune to your newborn baby? And then we tell you that you haven't bonded with your baby. How are we setting women up to fail by having a system that expects them to appear in court so soon? And this is increasing, as you can see from this graph. This is a new coming out from Bashar and Judith Harwin. Just a point to make here about final legal order. So what we're interested in here, you can see the key under the legal orders, but it's this bottom line here that really shows that it's the youngest children that are the most likely to be subject to placement orders and to be adopted. Again, that won't be a surprise to you, but if we think about the stakes are so high for these youngest children and what it means for their futures and their contact with their birth family. I'm not going to go into the data linkage now, but I would just really urge you to look at some of this new information that's coming out from being able to link databases in Wales. And there's been really interesting work done by Lucy Griffiths and looking at pregnancy data, maternity data, deprivation data by Steffi Dobler, and then most recently and coming out soon from Bashar, looking at return to court. And just to make this final point, and I need to stop, but what we've found now from the first recurrent care data, we were talking about women having a 1 in 4 chance of return to court. And what Bashar's latest analysis is showing, that actually if you just look at women who've had another baby, because 2/3 haven't in this 5-year window, so of those third that do go on to have another baby, there is a 1 in 2 chance of return to court. So, again, when we start thinking about this, this is really important to be able to support families and to stop this really damaging cycle. And I will stop there. So thank you very much for bearing with me.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Polly Radcliffe, who is a Senior Research Fellow at King's College London and recently completed NIHR, I can't say that without putting real full stops in between, funded Stepping Stone study, a multi-method study exploring the experience of women who use or are in treatment for using drugs in the perinatal period. And she will present key findings from her study. So, over to you, Polly, once your slides are up and working. Actually, while I'm doing this, I need to also point out something that I missed earlier, and that is we have the amazing Tonka with us, who I think I can see over the top of the table. They've hidden her from me. But she is going to be recording the day in illustrations. And if you would like to see her at any point, then I'm sure she'd love a chat. But also, part of one of the research projects that we're involved in that you're going to hear about later, she came along to meet us and we worked with her and we've produced illustrations to sit alongside the research that we developed, the Mums at Risk research, and there are copies of the illustrations in the coffee breakout room and also postcards with the illustrations on, and I'm sure if any of the mums involved are about, they'd be happy to explain some of the background to some of the illustrations. So thank you to Tonka for coming, and I'm looking forward to seeing more amazing pictures. Over to you, Polly.
Thank you, and thanks so much for inviting me along today. So the Stepping Stones study, as Angela was saying, was funded by the National Institute for Health Research, and we were. I'm at King's College London, but I was working with colleagues from the University of Stirling, University of Huddersfield, and from Homerton Hospital Foundation Trust. And so I'm talking about a study which had various components, but I'm particularly focusing on the qualitative study that we did. And we asked the question, how women who are dependent on drugs, so who use drugs or in treatment for drugs, experiences services and their care journeys, and how these experiences impact on age engagement and outcomes for women and their infants. So we were talking about the perinatal period. The background has been very well covered already by, so we were, the background to the study is that women who use drugs in the perinatal period have complex health and social care needs. Claire and colleagues' work has shown how that there's evidence of a rise of repeat removals of infants in England and Wales, substantially from women with complex needs, including women who use substances. And we know from Martha Canfield's linked data work in South London that there are really high rates of out-of-home placements, significantly higher for women who use substances. And there is also increasing evidence that families are brought into the children's social care system not necessarily because of evidence of harm to children, but because of the adversities that they're experiencing. So substance use and all the adversities that comes with that. So mental health problems, domestic abuse, poverty and poor housing. And that was something that was noted in the Independent Review of Social Care in 2021 and is something that we should be concerned about. So this was a qualitative study. We recruited women via maternity services, and we recruited women who were up to 9 months pregnant or up to 9 months postnatal, who used opioid stimulants and or benzodiazepine, were over 18 and spoke English. And we conducted interviews and timelines with 36 women in 4 contrasting sites in Scotland. And we aimed to conduct up to 5 interviews. So we had 4 brilliant researchers in the 4 sites who kept in touch with women over an extensive period. And we worked alongside peer advisors and women with lived and living experience of substance use and maternity care and of children's social care experience, who helped us with developing recruitment materials, and throughout the study they were sort of advised us and helped us with recruitment in all different ways. We were working alongside women with lived and living experience. So the interviews were audio recorded and transcribed. So this is our it was longitudinal recruitment, and so we had 36 women and we managed to retain 18, so half of those, for 5 interviews throughout the study. And we lost some women along the way for various reasons, sometimes because they moved out of the area, and sometimes just because they had so much going on and that they couldn't, stay involved in the research study. This is the profile of the women that took part in the study. 23 of whom were pregnant at the first interview, 13 were postnatal, 32 used or in treatment for opioid use. Over 90% were white British, white European, but that was not the case. So we had really only one site where there were minoritised women in the study. Most women were heterosexual, and they most came with complex histories. You can see on the right-hand side the sorts of nearly 80% of the of the sample, so 29 women, described having been either diagnosed or experiencing mental health problems. 12 women, so a third, reported previous suicide attempts, and nearly a third reported having survived overdoses. So we looked at the 4 sites, and across the pathways we found really variable access to services and support. We've talked already about postcode lottery, and the sort of Paul Bywater's work has shown the different sorts of risk of children going into care in different parts of the country. But you can see that there are different across the care pathways, there were different sorts of support. So whether or not women had access to substance use specialist midwifery care, and the approaches to engaging and advocating for women with the highest level of need was very substantially different. Substance use services and multidisciplinary care models differed across the pathways, and access to perinatal mental health support services differed. And we came to see that there were kind of really critical moments at each point in the care pathway where the opportunity and access to specific sorts of support and services made a huge difference to outcomes for women. Just going through a few, sorry, I know I've slightly run out of time. Just wanted to say, what do women say about their experiences prenatally? And they talked about anxiety, about they didn't know until very late on in their pregnancies whether or not they were going to have a social services referral, and whether or not they were going to be allowed to retain care of their babies. So this woman said, it felt like I was being treated like a surrogate by everyone. About 10 days before I was getting induced, it was a bit nerve-wracking because I was thinking, I'm nearly at the end of it. Is he going to be coming home with me, or are they going to take him? So anxiety around social care involvement prevailed for these women prenatally. And postnatally, they felt often, when services had often dropped away, that they were being set up to fail. The only time they come and see me is for the assessment. They don't take me and say, are you all right? None of that. So there's all the support and services were focusing on the baby. Lack of integrated care, funding models for postnatal substance use treatment. So this woman says the baby is funded through children's social care, but I think it was the drug service who funded me for residential rehab for mother and babies. They felt as though they were jumping through hoops. One of the key findings was a lack of understanding on the part of children's social care of the need for opioid replacement treatment for women, and the association of those medications with illicit drug use, and lack of understanding that being on those sorts of medication really enable women to lead stable lives and to care for their babies. So what is needed postnatally is intensive sorts of support and including substance use treatment, and opioid replacement therapy can be part of that. We had a co-produced theory of change, and we came up with some recommendations for each of the phases. And for the postnatal period, our recommendations are that women can say, I have access to the kind of substance use treatments that I want and I'm able to engage with. I have access to supported housing and rehabilitation with my baby if I need or want it. If my baby is not able to be with me, I'm supported to visit them and maintain contact. If my baby is not able to stay with me, I have support to deal with this, recover and thrive. I get expert advice and support with my mental health if I need it. So that should be part of the optimal model of care. I've brought with me some reports, and they're not shiny and beautiful with lovely illustrations, but we're going to be working on something that looks a bit more like that. I think these key findings really just cover what I've said already, but thank you so much. And if anybody would like to contact me for more information, I'd be really happy to hear from you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Polly. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Katie Birch, and here I go with the glasses again, was formerly a childcare lawyer and is now Assistant Director of the Institute of Public Care at Oxford Brookes University. Her most recent research has looked into parents with learning disabilities or difficulties in care proceedings for their newborn baby, which was itself part of the Born Into Care research series, and she's going to give us an overview of this very important work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just aware that this is this marvellous screen here, which is showing me which slide I'm on, but it means I can't.
No,
it's fine. So I'm going to have to do a bit of this as we go around. It's really interesting, isn't it? I can't see lots of the audience, but I like to be able to see people I'm talking with, and it's lovely to see you all here today. So the title of my presentation is a little long-winded. But I'm hoping not to be long-winded in my presentations. So, babies in care proceedings, we've already heard mention about babies in care proceedings, but of course, this is when the most important decisions about their future with birth parents or in care, including kinship care, are made. So the stakes, as Claire said earlier in her presentation, are incredibly high. So within that context, the question that I was asked a few years ago was, what do we know about parents in that situation who have learning disabilities or learning difficulties? So this was a study I went on to lead with colleagues at Oxford Brookes University, and it was funded and supported by the great Nuffield Family Justice Observatory. So what were we asked to explore in this study? Well, two things essentially. Firstly, we were asked to look at what proportion of care proceedings involving babies, so that's children under 1 year at the beginning of care proceedings, in what proportion of those cases do parents have learning disabilities or learning difficulties? And there have been some other studies before that had tried to do that and identify those numbers and proportions, but we hadn't really got quite close enough. So that's still a really important question to ask. But the second question was equally important. For those parents with learning disabilities and learning difficulties, what were their journeys like? What were their experiences like as they came into contact with children's social care services and on a journey through those services and into care proceedings? So we were asked to look at those two things equally. Just briefly about what we did in that study, there were three key elements to the study. We were able to talk with some parents, nowhere near enough parents. We'd aimed to talk with at least 10 to 15. It was incredibly difficult to recruit parents with learning disabilities or difficulties with a recent experience of care proceedings. And we've learned a lot through this study about how to better perhaps recruit and make contact with those parents to help to ask them if they would like to be involved. We also talked with a number of professionals involved in and around care proceedings, so social care workers, but also, and unusually in terms of research studies, we also talked with lawyers, so solicitors, barristers, and judges who were involved in care proceedings. So we got an awful lot of information from them about how they, about their experience in these cases. So, but a key element of the study involved a review of the social work case files, but also the court bundles, critically, that were to do with the 50 most recently concluded care proceedings involving babies, so aged under 1 year at the issue. So we did that across 4 local authority areas in 4 completely different parts of England. So we had a total of 200 sample of the most recently concluded care proceedings involving babies, okay, across 4 different areas. That was a really critical part. And arguably the headline finding from the study was that in approximately 1/3 of cases, actually as you can see just over 1/3 of cases, there was evidence of at least one parent with learning disabilities or learning difficulties. And when I say evidence, I mean really robust evidence, so mostly from expert reports that were presented to the court. In just under a slightly lower proportion, so in 30% of all the mothers had learning disabilities or learning difficulties. And although there was a spectrum, as you'd expect, you know, with learning disabilities and learning difficulties, in most cases, these parents, the ones who were identified in court reports and so on, expert reports to the court as having learning disabilities or difficulties, these were parents with what we've defined here as diagnosed or diagnosable learning disabilities, or parents with borderline learning disabilities who other research colleagues, Tarleton and Turney, have pointed out often struggle with similar issues to those with diagnosable disabilities or difficulties. So, quite a high proportion. Just going back, if I can, really high proportion that. I don't know if you're surprised by that proportion, but when I've talked with groups, other groups, particularly of professionals, social workers and lawyers, I get different responses. Some people say, really? I would have thought that's much higher. And other people say, oh, wow, that really is quite high indeed. Whatever your thoughts on that, our study went on to identify a number of things at play, really, in that child and parent journey into and through social care and into care proceedings. We found identified some good, some very good practice. You know, practice like social workers really taking care to identify and talk over with parents what their learning needs, and in some cases communication needs were and are at really early stage, developing a communications passport that went with the parent. Because of course, if you're in care proceedings and social care, you don't have just one worker, you have an army of workers with whom you have to engage. And so that passport going with you so that all of those other workers could understand what your communication needs in particular are. So we found some examples like that and some other really good adaptive practice of social workers. However, I can't hand on heart say that that was the norm. That was the exception. But a big factor, perhaps the biggest factor and issue, was the timeliness of things and things happening too slowly. And most of that, I must say, wasn't within the gift of individual social workers. This was to do with, we heard earlier, mentioned right at the start, the culture, the organisational factors that got in the way. So particularly long delays in identifying parents' learning needs. So in 3/4 of the cases we looked at, parents' learning needs were only identified at the beginning of care proceedings when their solicitor or barrister said, we need to explore this a bit more, and therefore things can be adapted. So what that we're identifying parents' learning needs late? Well, that meant, and for me, that means that social worker communications, the assessments that they lead, and the support that hopefully can be put in place cannot be tailored, because if you don't understand what parents' learning needs are, you cannot tailor the support appropriately. And that's during pregnancy and into the early weeks and months of that child's life. Arguably, parents are less likely to engage well with you, the lead worker, or with other people. I mean, or with the support on offer if you're not offering something that's tailored to their needs. Also, arguably, court time and resources are wasted. Why? Because at least some of the key things like parenting assessments need to be repeated because they haven't been done properly before court proceedings. It's a waste of time and resources. I think, because I haven't got my specs on, was that a 1 minute? Oh, so not 1 minute. What's needed in the future? So basically, if I want to leave you with one key message from my presentation, it's this: that this is not a niche area of practice, as is often believed to be the case culturally, organisationally within children's social care services. So that's the key thing. But of course I want also better support for workers to help them identify parents' learning needs and communication needs, and more and better adapted supports, including for parenting, as well as better access to advocacy. This is going to give, as Brooklyn said earlier, this is going to help to give parents with learning disabilities and difficulties their fair chance. And hopefully will also lead to a reduction of the number of babies coming into care. Change is afoot. I do know that. I've spoken to groups and individuals at national level and individual local authorities. It is afoot, but I think we're still in the early, sorry to use foot again, foothills. I think so much more. We need to really accelerate the change here. So I'll leave you with that parting thought that this is not niche, and we do need to think much more. A study report.